Hi, and welcome to another episode of Ask on CYC. So buying property without any advice or legal help is like eating at a restaurant with the lights turned off. You don't know what you're eating, or you don't know what you're getting into, so you have to rely on certain senses. But here in Australia, it's recommended to seek advice before buying property. And that's why we give you this special episode where we give you free legal advice. However, in order for us to give you the free legal advice, we need you to tune in to ask questions so you can get your answered on live show tonight. The phone number is 0416 551 292. Send us a text or give us a call and speak to our solicitor on tonight's show. So let me introduce you to our solicitor. We have with us Mina Hanna.
Hi Mina, how are you?
Welcome, Mina.
Thank you.
You're not a first-time visitor on Ask.
No.
And it's a pleasure to have you again on Ask.
Thank you.
So we're giving free legal advice on live TV. You know, what more could people ask for?
Absolutely. Dial in and ask. Happy to answer.
That's it. So let's start off tonight's show with probably the $1 million question. And the reason why I say $1 million because now the average property prices in Australia is $1 million. However, 5 years ago, the average property prices in Sydney was about 500,000. So what has happened in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I think in Sydney especially, we've experienced unprecedented property growth. And the unprecedented property growth is for a number of reasons. Number one, obviously, overseas investors. So foreign buyers coming into our market, finding it quite attractive and buying up property. I think the latest statistics are 77% of foreign buyers in New South Wales are from China. Then comes the USA, Indonesia, and even Nepal factor into that. So we have a lot of international buyers interested in Australian real estate. And the reason for that is previously the Australian government, I think, was fairly liberal and invited these people in to take the property without having any safeguards around tax or any obligations that they may have whilst they're here and purchasing property. The other reason is I think banks have been a lot more lenient in their lending since the GFC. There was obviously a big downturn in the market during the GFC. Banks have, during the last 5 to 6 years, have loosened their lending requirements, and therefore capital's become a lot more readily available to families to purchase property. And as a result, property prices, as you said, have gone from an average median price of $500,000 to now over $1 million in Sydney.
Okay, so there's more people who want to buy than there are properties being sold.
Absolutely.
All because of these international buyers who've come in and just opened doors to opportunity.
Yeah, and I think the other thing as well is the growth of multi-level developments. So large unit developments have just sprung up all over Sydney. Councils and state government have encouraged that kind of development to catch up with the demand for property, because there is a demand for property from young families, from people who can't afford to buy big blocks of land, which was the great Australian dream, which is now gone. Having, your large property with a picket fence out the front, that's gone. So that's been replaced by high-rise buildings. So there's been a lot of development in Sydney over the last 5 to 10 years in that regard.
Okay, so let's take this step by step. What's the first thing that we should do if we're interested in a property and we went to the first open house or even just a private inspection?
Look, I think most people are aware of this, but we'll put it out there. You've got to make sure you've got your finances in order. There's no point going to an open for inspection knowing that the property is going to be around $1 to $1.2 million, but you haven't actually sat with your bank yet and formalised all the paperwork to get what we call a pre-approval or approval in principle that the bank will lend you a certain amount. And that's quite important because that will give you some comfort if you get a letter from the bank saying we're willing to lend you up to $1 million. That gives you some comfort if you go to an auction that you know what your limit is when you bid. Having said that, recently, given APRA regulations which have tightened the lending requirements for banks, even if you do get a pre-approval, unfortunately, that doesn't guarantee you that when you come to buy a property, the bank will honour that. So you just need to be very careful as how you approach your finances.
Okay, so next step is obviously you negotiate a price, and once you're happy with the price, the real estate agent will probably tell you, here's the contract, sign it. Is it okay if someone skims through the contract, or must they seek legal advice first?
Absolutely. You need to get legal advice. I mean, these are legally binding contracts with at least 60 to 70 pages of legal jargon. You need to get a solicitor to go through the contract to make sure there's no pitfalls in that contract, or at least you understand what your obligations are and what you're getting into if you decide to sign that contract. So what a solicitor will do, they'll look at the contract, they'll look at the title to see whether there are any caveats or notations on the title that may affect the passing of good title to you when you buy the property. They'll look at where the sewer diagram or the sewer runs through the property, what the special conditions on the contracts are that you need to be aware of. And recently in Sydney, as you're aware, the government is approving all these new freeways, South Sydney, West Connex. So now, even more than before, it's important that if you buy a property, you also search whether the property that you're buying is going to be adversely affected by either a road widening or a new freeway going through your property or adjoining your property. So there's lots of searches that you need to do, a lot of advice you need to get on the contract before you even put pen to paper and sign. So negotiating the price is the easiest thing. Understanding your obligations on the contract is a different thing altogether.
I know the first thing that I look for when I grab a contract is if there's a caveat on the house. What is a caveat?
So a caveat is an interest on the title from another party. So usually you'll see that if someone is owed money, they want to guarantee the payment of that money, they could lodge a caveat on your house. And that caveat flows with the title. So if you buy that property and that caveat hasn't been removed, then suddenly you have this money owing on the property which follows you. So you suddenly have to owe this person whatever the amount is that they've lodged on the caveat. So when we look at that sort of stuff, we want to make sure we negotiate with the other side, the caveats are removed, any negative affectations on title are removed before settlement. So when you buy the property, you buy it with clear title. It's yours. Well, it's the bank's, but you own it alongside the bank at the end of the day.
So most real estate agents advise if there is a caveat on the property that don't worry, by the time settlement comes, the caveat will be gone. Is that something that we can go on, or
no,
are they...
that's not necessarily the case. It's got to be agreed between the solicitors, and there has to be a firm indication from the other side that it will be removed at settlement. And so we add that in as a special condition on the contracts.
Okay, so another thing that I wanted to ask, for example, if you're still a bit hesitant about your bank giving you your final approval, is it something that we can ask our solicitor to extend the settlement period?
You can. So recently, given the APRA's new requirements where banks are tightening their lending to reduce their risk portfolio, there have been situations where banks just haven't been able to approve a loan before settlement. So in that situation, you can ask the other side to extend settlement out by a certain period of time, but unfortunately there is penalty interest attached, which is usually around 8 to 10% per annum, calculated daily for every day that you delay settlement. So you need to go in fairly certain that you have the finance and that it will be ready by settlement before you sign the contract. Otherwise, if you know there's going to be a problem before you sign the contract, instead of agreeing to the standard 42 days, which is 6 weeks between exchange and completion, you can negotiate a longer period of time for completion to occur.
Okay. So with the deposit, it must be paid upon signing of the contract. How much percent are we talking about?
Look, if it's not an auction, if it's just a normal negotiation, you can put down 0.25% deposit to take the property off the market, and legally the agent is not allowed to advertise the property or show people through that property once they got the 0.25%. You then have 5 days cooling off. In those 5 days, you do your searches inquiries. You get your solicitor to look at the contract. You can do a building report to see if the house is stable, pest report, see whether it's been infested by termites. You can do survey reports to make sure the boundaries are where they should be. And most importantly, during those 5 days, you make sure your finance is in order. If during those 5 days you're happy, you then pay either a 10% deposit, which is in the contract, or people now negotiate down to about 5% deposit after the 5 business days cooling off.
Okay, but with auctions, there isn't the 5
Auctions,
days.
yeah. A pitfall of auctions, which everyone needs to be aware of. If you're buying at auction, there's no cooling off. The moment the hammer comes down and you're the successful bidder, you're committed to settlement on whatever terms the contract was at the time of auction.
There's a situation where I've come across where there's been a lot of interest on a property and it was not going to auction. However, the agent has requested the signature of a signing of a 66W to waiver the cooling off period. So what is this 66W?
So 66W is a certificate that your purchasing solicitor will send to the other side, which basically waives the purchaser's entitlement to a cooling off period. So if the property is going to auction and the auction is coming up in 2 to 3 weeks' time, it may be that they'll say, fine, we can sign the contracts today, but we're not going to give you a cooling off period. So we're going to sell it to you as if it's under auction condition.
Okay.
Again, buyer beware. Before you've done that, make sure you've done your homework, your searches, your finances in order, and you're ready to commit.
Sure. Just a reminder to our audience members, this is a live show. When you're giving you free legal advice, please, the only way that it could be free to use if you tune in and ask the questions yourselves and not use my questions, because your questions could be different to mine. The phone number is 0416 551 292. Send us a text or give us a call and speak to the solicitor for free legal advice. Thank you.
CYC, Christian Youth Channel.
Welcome back to Ask, where we're giving free legal advice tonight. The phone number is 0416 551 292. Send us a text or give us a call and speak to the solicitor tonight on live show about buying or selling property. Free legal advice. It's all yours tonight. The phone number is 0416 551 292. So going back, and let's talk about land tax. So what does land tax mean when it comes to buying and selling property?
Yeah, so land tax is a concept that not many people fully understand. Again, it's a state tax, so it's a tax to the government, just like stamp duty is, but it's a tax for the privilege of owning a second property or an investment property. So a property that you don't live in, you've bought it, you rent it out to someone, and you just get the capital increase in that property. So if you have an investment property that you own as at the 31st of December on any year, you need to register that property with the Office of State Revenue, and they'll send you out a notification as to the value that you need to pay the government that year for the privilege of having an investment property. So for a property valued at about $500,000, it could be up to $3,000 to $4,000 of land tax you've got to pay every year. So you've got to factor that in as well in terms of ownership of property. Now for foreign buyers, if we go back to foreign buyers, they pay 2% as well. So they pay an additional rate for owning.
Are we talking about land value?
Based on land value.
Not property value.
Not property value, so
Yep.
yes, based on the land value as determined by the government.
Sure. But when you come to sell, who pays the land tax that's owing that year?
Yeah, so recently they changed legislation. So when you come to sell a property, you have to make sure you've paid the land tax in full before you sell the property, and you need to provide the purchaser with a clear land tax certificate. So that ensures that the property that they're purchasing is not encumbered with any other tax. Now you can negotiate before you sign the contract and say to them, look, I've paid $5,000 of land tax this year. Let's apportion it so you pay the land tax that would have been payable had you had it from halfway through the year. So if you sold the property on 1 July, you can say to them, we'll split the land tax 50-50. Purchaser doesn't have to agree to that, but that's a point of negotiation between the parties.
Sure. Okay. So let's talk about, like, if you're buying property under either Torrens title or under the strata scheme. What's the difference?
So Torrens title is it gives you comfort, what we call indefeasibility of title, so that what you're buying is what you get on the title. Before that, we had something called old systems title. So when you bought a property, you had massive A1 sheets of paper, and you had to go back to when the land was first purchased to determine that there was no break in ownership or title passing. Now that we have Torrens system title, you can rely on the document that you received from the Land Titles Office as evidence that that's the property that you're purchasing. Strata is obviously for units. Strata, you're not buying land, you're simply buying air. That's the definition. So when you're buying a strata property, you're buying the air above the land where the unit is.
Is the unit subject to land tax?
Yes. All property is subject to land tax. There is a minimum threshold that you need to breach before land tax becomes payable.
So going back to the strata, so you buy, for example, a townhouse or a villa, and you want to build a swimming pool in your backyard, you're not entitled to do this.
It becomes a bit more complicated because the land around you is not yours. It's not Torrens title. It's not on your title. It actually is common property. So technically the neighbour can knock down the fence between the two townhouses and say we're going to combine the backyard. So you can't really put in a swimming pool unless you have the proper meetings and the proper approvals with the rest of the strata body corporate to make that happen. So it is slightly more technical.
Sure. We just got a question that came in from an audience member. They're asking, hasn't the APRA tightened lending based on banks over lending? Is it still easy to get a loan?
So APRA, which is the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority in Australia, they regulate banks, they regulate lending, they regulate super funds as well. They provide guidance to the banks as to what their risk profiles are and how to manage their risk profiles. In the last GFC, I think the 4 big banks in Australia were one of the strongest banks in the world that didn't really go through the tough times that we saw around the world with some of the other banks that required bailouts. And that's because APRA takes a very close look at what the risk portfolio of each bank is. Now, they released in March a memo which pretty much indicated that the banks are taking on too much risk. Their risk portfolio is too high and they need to minimise it. So some of the recommendations which they made was for interest-only loans, they didn't encourage it at all. They would rather people only take principal and interest loans. And they also discouraged banks from lending for investment purposes only. So if you're going to buy a property for yourself that you're going to live in, that's okay. If you're borrowing money to buy investment properties, APRA encouraged the banks to pull back the reins on that kind of lending.
Sure. Okay, let's move on to settlement. What are your rights in terms of settlement? For example, a scenario for you, if you were told to inspect the property on the day of settlement and you find a broken down car that's sitting, no tyres, and in the backyard that's been not removed, and obviously you want to move in and you don't want it there, what are your entitlements in terms of settling with that car removed?
Yeah, so the law in New South Wales is fairly clear. So when you buy a property, you buy the fittings that are attached to the building, right? So if you grab your house, you turn it upside down, anything that doesn't fall out, so the light switches, the chandeliers, the kitchens, is a fixture of the house which you buy. Rubbish in the back of the house, a car or whatever, that doesn't flow with the house. The owner of that property should have got rid of all that before settlement. Now, if you inspect the property on the day of settlement, you find it covered in rubbish, they haven't taken out their furniture, settlement can still proceed, but you need to negotiate on the day that a sum, which is the deposit being held by the agent, be retained after settlement until the property is clean. So you could negotiate $1,000, $2,000, whatever you think is a reasonable cost to clean it up, be withheld until either they come back and clean the property or you bring in a contractor to clean the property yourself.
Okay. We just got another question that came in from an audience member. It goes back to caveat. If there is a caveat on the property and you buy it at an auction, can you get it removed after the auction?
Look, it's a lot more difficult. It's a buyer beware. New South Wales buying property, it's a buyer beware system. You need to do all your homework before you buy the property. If you notice there's a caveat on the property, there could be a million reasons why there's a caveat on that property. It could be a family dispute. It's gone through the family court. It could be the previous owner has defaulted on the loan and a bank's put a caveat. It could be a loan owing to someone. You need to ensure that you've negotiated the removal of that caveat before you buy the property. If you haven't and you've bought the property with a caveat on it, again, then it's up to negotiations between the parties as to whether they can get that removed before settlement or not. In some instances, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get it removed.
I know I've probably discussed this with you before the show, but let's say the caveat is only a couple of $1,000s and you're an investor and you just want to move on and settle. Is it possible for you to pay off the caveat?
It is an option, probably not the easiest option, probably not the preferred option, but I think you want to get a copy of the caveat from the titles office to understand what the purpose of the caveat is, for what amount, for how long it's going to be there. It's unusual to purchase a property with a caveat on the title. There's usually a clause in the special conditions requesting that it be removed either before or on the day of settlement.
Okay, very interesting. So the legal system is constantly changing in our country, and all these new laws are coming into play, especially with property. So what's the most recent laws that have changed in terms of vendors?
Well, interestingly, the changes that have occurred in the conveyancing space, the buying and selling of property, have been brought about by the state government's desire, if I could use that word, to try and level the playing field when it comes to buying property. So they were obviously concerned with the number of foreign buyers that have come into Australia, which have knocked out first home buyers from the market, have knocked out people who've been trying to buy property for a long time. So the taxes that the governments have come up with have been a way of trying to stem the flow of property offshore, or the sale of property offshore. So now for a vendor, when they come to sell a property, they need to get what we call now a foreign resident withholding tax clearance certificate, which basically puts the ATO on notice whether you're an Australian resident or not. If you're not an Australian resident and you can't get a clearance certificate before settlement, the purchaser by law has to remit 12.5% of the purchase price to the ATO on settlement. So they're basically forcing the purchaser to pay the vendor's tax at settlement straight to the ATO. Obviously, if you're an Australian citizen, you're an Australian resident, you'll get the clearance certificate. If you're not, then that money goes to the ATO. Also with purchaser declarations, when you come to purchase property, you need to now prove to the Stamp Duty Office, the Office of State Revenue, whether you're an Australian resident or not. If you're not, you pay an extra 8% on top of the normal stamp duty that you have to pay. Okay. So there's a lot of additional paperwork now that we need to complete in order to comply with the new vendor and purchaser obligations.
So are they doing all this to make it harder for international buyers?
Absolutely. They're making it harder and they're collecting money at the same time.
So it's a good chance for us local residents to get back into the game, making it easier for us now that they're kind of out of the picture.
Yeah, look, that's the idea. And I think recent statistics that have come out today have shown an influx of first home owner buyers back into the market for the first time in about 2 to 3 years. And it also shows an outflux of foreign buyers from Sydney market. So the changes have had an impact. But on top of that, property prices for the first time in decades have started to retreat and go backwards, which is an interesting trend.
Okay. We've got a question that just came in from an audience member. They're asking, what is the difference between a solicitor and a conveyancer, and what is a better option?
Okay, so a solicitor is someone who's gone through law school, legally trained, doesn't just do sale and purchase of residential property. They do all the other legal aspects that come with being a solicitor. A conveyancer is someone who studies a particular course and all they do is the conveyancing, the buying and selling of residential property. If things get a bit hairy in terms of the legal issues around a contract, you usually find a conveyancer will just pass it on to a solicitor to handle.
Sure.
It's up to each person's individual preference which one they use.
Okay, but maybe go with the person they're comfortable with. They
Absolutely.
say you've got to trust your...
Trust your gut, trust your instinct. If you trust the person that you're dealing with, good. If it's a straightforward conveyance, even better. The moment it gets a bit hairy or technical, usually it moves on to a lawyer who can work through it.
But you don't know what's hidden. That's the problem. You don't know what's hidden underneath these properties.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's a very technical area. Conveyancing is a very technical area with lots of pitfalls. Inside the contract, there's a lot of pitfalls. The searches and inquiries have to reveal whether there are problems with the property or not. As I said, the state government's recent expenditure on road widening and new freeways has meant that if you are anywhere near an arterial road or you abut a new freeway, you need to do the search to see whether the state government has an interest in that property as well.
It's funny that you just mentioned that, because the question that just came in from an audience member, they're asking, if you seek solicitor guidance and they fail to mention that there's a freeway going to be built, are they accountable for this mistake?
Look, not necessarily. I think there's an element of the buyer needs to be aware of the area that they're buying in. So the solicitor is not going to know the area necessarily that you intend on buying in. They're not necessarily going to know whether there's a freeway going to be running through that property. As part of your own due diligence as a buyer, you need to check whether a freeway is going to go through that property. You need to check whether there are any local activities which may affect, or any local proposals, even from the local government, that may affect the value of that property or the use of that property in the future. So I think if you look at the number of searches a solicitor can do, or we have access to, there's a huge number. If we were to do all the searches for all the properties that we receive, the client will get a bill in excess of a couple of thousand for us to do the searches. So solicitors have to be selective in the kind of searches they undertake. But if you as a buyer are aware that in this vicinity there may be a freeway, then you let the solicitor know and they can do that particular search for you.
Okay, I've got a hypothetical for you. Maybe a bit of a hard one, but I've just heard this recently that some developers are doing this, and how can a buyer protect himself? When the new properties are being registered at the land titles office, I've heard that some buyers are taking this process longer than normal, so the purchaser can rescind and move on, so they can sell it at higher prices. How can a purchaser protect themselves from this happening?
I think the state government has addressed that issue and is trying to stop the practice of developers purposely trying to delay a settlement so they can rescind the contract and sell to someone else. I mean, that's only relevant in a rising market. Okay, so in a rising market, you can buy a property off the plan for $500,000. Before it's finished, it's worth $700,000, right? The purchaser, the vendor tries to delay settlement to cancel it and then resell it at a higher price. That was happening a lot. The state government's tried to crack down on that. But when you come to negotiate your contract, you can say, okay, if the vendor is delaying the building or settlement, it's only up to the purchaser whether they want to pull out of the contract or not. It shouldn't be two ways. And that's something you can negotiate with your solicitor to have put into the contract.
Sure. Okay. Please, if you have any questions, send it to 0416 551 292. All the questions that you are sending are coming through to me. Thank you to all those who got involved. Please send your questions. We're giving free legal advice tonight. This is a one-time special. Send in your questions and I'll ask it straight to our solicitor. Thank you. So the question that just came in, they're saying, if I have received a land tax bill for the house that I live in, can I appeal this? Are there any time limits?
Look, it's a good question. The question is, was that your principal place of residence as at 31 December last year, midnight? So the law is at midnight on 31 December, if that was your principal place of residence, and you can prove it, council rates, water rates, electricity rates, mail going to your address, then no land tax is payable. If you move in, so if it's an investment property on 31 December, but then you move in on the 2nd of January, you still pay land tax. Because the law says, as at 31 December at midnight, it was an investment property. Unless you can prove otherwise, you pay land tax for that full year.
That's if you move in.
Yeah, so if it becomes your principal place of residence during the course of the year, but it was an investment property as at 31 December last year, you still pay land tax on that property.
Sure, because someone can buy it in December, however, start applying for utility such as electricity and gas and change their home address maybe in January. So is that
yeah, look, I'm sure they take that into account. So if there's anomalies whereby you can't show that you've settled in December but you haven't moved until January, they'll understand that you've planned, you intended on that house being your principal place of residence on the day you settled. And probably a letter from the solicitor stating that would probably suffice.
Sure.
Yeah, but that's a tricky one. You've just got to make sure if you're going to move in, you move in before 31 December. Otherwise, you're going to get hit with the land tax bill.
Okay, we've got another question that's come in. They're asking, is the council enough to contact regarding all the information you need regarding a potential property? What other places do you recommend?
Okay, so council will issue what's called a 149 certificate in the contract. That's automatically in your contract. That 149 certificate contains a lot of information that council holds on that particular property or on the area. So if it's heritage, it will say the property's heritage, you can't touch it. If it's prone to flooding, if it's prone to bushfires, if there's a local road widening proposal for that area, that will all appear in the 149 certificate. Whether you can knock it down, what it's zoned, all sorts of... So council is a great first point of call for understanding what could be an adverse effect on the property. The solicitors, well, the other way, another thing you need to do, of course, is your building and pest reports, as we said earlier, and your survey on the boundary lines. But the solicitors also have access to other searches that you're not going to get from council. So I have direct access to state government searches around freeways. Now, will there be a freeway through here? I can find out whether the land is being contaminated or not, whether there's a register of contamination. Contracts now have to disclose whether, for houses built before 1985, whether the house has loose fill asbestos insulation, which is highly dangerous. So there's now a central register which determines whether this house has that dangerous substance in the roof or not. So all these things we have access to. It comes down to how prudent do you want to be? How concerned are you that there could be something wrong there? And you need to guide the solicitor as well as to what you want in terms of comfort.
How about flight zones?
They're also disclosed in the 149 certificate. So if you're under a flight path, it'll say the noise level either exceeds the standard or is below the average or whatever the case is. That again is in the 149 certificate.
Sure. So this brings us to the end of the show, and if you had to end with a piece of advice that you've probably seen a million times and you keep telling your clients, stop, what advice would you give people out there who want to buy or sell property?
Look, I think the basic piece of advice is do your homework. If you like a property, do your homework around it, send your contract to a solicitor to review, speak to your bank, make sure the finance is in order, make sure you can afford the stamp duty, the land tax if it's going to be rented out or an investment property. And another piece of advice is make sure that your loan is not due to expire before settlement. So loans typically are 3 months in duration and then you need to reapply, or 6 months in some banks. Make sure that from the moment you bid or exchange to the moment you settle, your loan is not going to expire. Otherwise you'll be reapplying.
I'd like to thank you for being an Ask, and I'm sure the audience out there who've tuned in and asked you these questions, thank you for the free advice that you've given them. And it's a pleasure having you on Ask, and we look forward to having you again on different matters.
Thank you very much, Mina. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience members who've tuned in tonight's show. And thank you for those who asked questions who benefit from the free legal advice on tonight's show. I'm Mina Ibrahim from your CYC studios in Sydney. Good night and God bless.
CYC Christian Youth Channel.